Hello. Welcome, everyone. I see the attendance rising. I probably give another 2 or 3 minutes for people to come into the session. We are over 100 people now, so this is excellent. Thank you for joining us today. Perhaps I start by telling you who I am. My name is Eric Chin. I'm a general counsel with the National Library, Public Libraries, and National Archives of Singapore. I'm a member of the expert legal group on legal matters, and as people are coming in, I can share that this webinar had its genesis actually back in the Congress at Abu Dhabi, when the expert legal group had an open session, and quite a number of members and institutions who attended the session asked whether we could look into the laws that related to oral history. And so a couple of years later, here we are. I must admit that in Singapore, we love our oral history. It has shown its strength in covering many gaps in historical records in Singapore. So I'm a little biased there, and therefore I put up my hand for this particular project. Right, so let me show you what's in store for us today. Let me put up a quick slide. Right. Okay, so we'll be delving into the question of oral history as archives and the laws that relate to it. We will start with a keynote presentation by Mark Wong on the discussion about archives as oral histories as archives. It will be followed by a panel discussion, and we will then have a Q&A where we invite everyone to put your questions in the Q&A section, right? I know people sometimes like to use the chat, but and feel free to have your chats in the chat section. But if you have a specific question you want to put to the panel during the Q&A and open forum section of this webinar, please put your questions in the chat. Of course, as the keynote presentation is going on and as the panel discussions are going on, if you have any questions that come to mind at that point, please, of course, start putting in your questions into the Q&A. Right. Well, this webinar will not be, I think we're in for an interesting day because I've 3 wonderful colleagues who have put their hands up to be part of this panel today. If I can take the time to do a quick readout on their short biographies. We have Mark Wong, who is a senior specialist oral history at the Oral History Center of the National Archives of Singapore, where he leads the oral history projects on politics, the public service, and Singapore's experience with COVID-19. He is also a PhD student at the University of Canberra, where he is researching on archived oral histories. He was formerly Vice President of the International Oral History Association from 2018 to 2023. We have also Dr. Nompilo Ndlovu, who is an oral historian whose PhD was in historical studies, where she explored mass violence, memory, and transitional justice in post-colonial Zimbabwe. She has over a decade of experience in academic and policy settings, and her work engages qualitative methods, life histories, and vernacular archives. And she has field experience in conflict zones as well. She lectures in the Department of Historical Studies at University of Cape Town and has affiliations with the United Nations, the African Union, the International Oral History Association, and the South African Commission for Gender Equality. We also have with us Charlie Morgan, who is the oral history archivist at the National Life Stories and the British Library. He is chair of the Archives and Oral History Special Interest Group in the Oral History Society and was the lead author on the Oral History Society's guidelines on remote recording during the COVID-19 pandemic. During a recent Coleridge Fellowship at the British Library, Charlie conducted research into the relationships between archives, oral histories, and UK public inquiries. With that, I think we can move to the first part of today's webinar. Can I shall stop sharing and I invite my colleague Mark Wong to begin his presentation.
Thank you so much, Eric. Let me just share my screen as we transition. So hopefully you can see this now. And I'm just going to go full screen and I'm going to do that. Okay, so here we go. So please at any time if you cannot hear me or anything, maybe Eric, you can just let me know. But to my distinguished colleagues, good day, evening, or any time in between. I would like to thank the ICA, especially the expert group on legal matters. This would be Eric Chin, Sarah Choi, Patria Duval, and Malcolm Todd for organizing and supporting this webinar. Charlie and Nompilo for being fellow panelists. And special thanks to my National Archives colleague, Pang Lai Thi, for her behind-the-scenes support. I work at the Oral History Center, a department of the National Archives of Singapore. And my views have been forged from Singapore's experience of a long relationship between the archives and the Oral History Center. More than 40 years of ebbs and flows, with both at different points in our shared history, spending time as separate units, as well as merged entities. The question posed in my address, Oral History as Archives, reflects decades of professional discourse. So today I wish to argue that not only is oral history archives, but that it represents one of our most dynamic and democratically vital archival forms. The domains of archives and oral history, as well as the value of memory and evidence, have so much to offer us, and more so where they overlap. For a long time, we have operated under narrow definitions of what constitutes archives. Traditional archival theory privileged the incidental, documents and records created as byproducts of organizational processes. But this perspective has excluded countless voices and experiences that are no less valid and no less essential to our collective memory. Our history challenges us to rethink archives fundamentally. While it is intentional rather than incidental, this characteristic does not diminish its archival value. It enhances it because it brings into archives the voices of people who might otherwise be excluded. This reminds us of the democratic values of archives. It is well acknowledged that traditional archives are not neutral and reflect the perspectives of their record creators. The colonial archive, for example, frequently excludes indigenous and other groups. Oral history fills critical gaps in the documentary record. It strengthens inclusivity and it extends the preservation expertise of archives to capture experiences that would otherwise be lost forever. Moreover, there are accepted archives that are intentionally created. Examples include audiovisual archives, where documentaries and cinematic films are collected without question. We must recognize that oral history serves the same fundamental purposes of preservation, accountability, and memory. Thus, it is noteworthy that the narrow definition of archives is not universally agreed, and I'm heartened to learn that the Southeast Asian regional branch of the ICA plans to form an expert group on oral history. Happily, we see growing acceptance of this broader, more inclusive definition of archives. And when the ICA accepted the Universal Declaration on Archives at the ICA's annual general meeting in Oslo in September 2010, we see evidence of this in its lead sentence: archives records decisions, actions, and memories. As I understand today's audience would have differing exposure to and experience with oral history, please allow me to give a sense of the development of oral history. Oral history as it developed in the middle of the last century bore the potential to enliven our historical documentation with the richness of sound, the voice, and emotions. However, there were questions about the reliability, validity, and subjective nature of oral history. These concerns were not unfounded. Oral history is a complex source reliant on memory and orality, and it took time to cultivate the best ways to collect, preserve, use, and interpret them. As the field matured, oral historians developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to oral history. They pushed back against critics of orality when they identified the oral sources of many sources of written history, like court documents, parliamentary debates, and journalist accounts, to have an oral source at their beginnings. Oral history, like any other source, could contain errors and biases, and it was incumbent on the user to triangulate sources to ensure reliability. The oral historian Alessandro Portelli, in fact, subverted the field of history by not only affirming that oral history was subjective, which was typically regarded as a flaw by traditional historians, but demonstrating that it could be a strength, providing deep insights into an individual's thoughts, feelings, dreams, desires, expectations, values, and their relations with others within their milieu. Oral history has since grown in its reach, and it has been embraced by many disciplines, from folklore studies to ethnography, anthropology, sociology, and more. This growth was also enabled by technological developments, from chunky reel-to-reel recorders to more easily portable digital machines that have made oral history more accessible with high quality of sound and today the moving image. With a growing international practice, it is a movement that cannot be ignored. What we have seen then is a maturation of oral history from method to methodology to field. Oral history has its own theoretical foundations, refined methodologies, professional organizations, and research paradigms. This maturation brings both opportunities and responsibilities, with oral historians seeing fit to develop legal and ethical frameworks to strengthen practice. This has led to growing institutional recognition of oral history collections' value and growing understanding of oral history's unique nature as an active creation of new records. Returning perhaps to the earlier question of the incidental versus the intentional, we do find that oral history has an inherent intentional and activist nature. Oral history is created, not just a byproduct of other activities. Thus, questions do arise if archives should be actively involved in creating oral history. I think we must be realistic about archives' role in relation to oral history. And just as there is potential value to be developed, so are there risks in active collecting programs. Oral history's activist nature means that we have the potential to fill gaps in the historical record. It strengthens inclusivity in archives. And in the other direction, it extends archives' existing preservation expertise to oral history. Yet we must remain wary of mission creep, resource strain, and the introduction of institutional biases into these oral history collections. Yet what I want to emphasize is that fundamentally there is an alignment of values, and oral history values are ICA values. And what are these? Identity. Oral history preserves and transmits individual and collective identities that might otherwise be lost. Democracy. By including voices traditionally excluded from documentary records, oral history democratizes the archive. Accountability. Oral history can create more transparent records of decision-making processes, experiences, and their consequences. And good governance. The legal and ethical frameworks governing oral history ensures responsible stewardship of sensitive information and relationships. These alignments demonstrate that oral history is not peripheral to archival practice, it is central to our mission. With that, I humbly offer some practical recommendations to fully realize the potential of oral history programs in archives and within the archives world. Firstly, to leverage subject expertise of archives and archivists to shape collection goals, ensuring oral history projects align with institutional missions and fill genuine gaps in documentary records. Secondly, to engage stakeholders, including academics, communities, and other gallery, library, archives, and museum institutions, to create collaborative approaches that serve multiple constituencies. Next, to commit to inclusivity in collections, actively seeking voices and perspectives that have been marginalized in traditional documentary records. Next, to provide robust preservation and access, treating oral history collections with the same professional standards applied to all other archival materials. Fostering collaborative interpretation and use means that we recognize oral history benefits from access and use, especially since its open nature is able to benefit not just historical research, but multiple domains and disciplines. Supporting training and capacity building means ensuring that staff and even external practitioners have the skills and knowledge needed for excellent practice. Using technology thoughtfully and innovatively to embrace digital and other tools while maintaining focus on human relationships and ethical responsibilities. And lastly, ensuring compliance with laws and ethical practices. These are not burdens, but foundations for trustworthy practice. As mentioned, with oral history's maturation, practitioners started to build frameworks to improve our practice. Laws and ethics can be said to be the foundation of oral history practice, a blanket that wraps around the professional standards, guidelines, and best practices that are constantly being developed, honed, and sharpened in order for us to do better oral history. So in my next 3 slides, I hope to build a bridge to our panel discussion by very briefly introducing some legal issues in oral history. At the collection phase, we do find a number of potential legal issues, from obtaining informed consent to clarifying copyright with interviewees. While recording interviews, we find that narrators may reveal private information about themselves or others. They may potentially say words construed as defamatory. At the end of the interview, we would need them to sign some kind of agreement or release. So there are so many potentially applicable laws, from copyright to privacy law, to contract law, to defamation law, and more. After recording an interview, the road to its preservation includes securing long-term copyright and permissions to ensure that sensitive or classified material is properly managed. The data stored must be secure with its integrity intact. And when retrieved in the future, we can say that it is authentic and it is what it says it is. To do this work of preservation, we then potentially need to observe copyright law, archives legislations, data security regulations, and digital preservation standards. Finally, when it comes to access and use, archives must manage that access while respecting any embargoes or restrictions requested. It must understand how to navigate fair use exceptions and be able to control the rights to reproduce, distribute, and display recordings. In short, it needs a firm grasp on privacy laws, data protection regulations, any Freedom of Information Acts, contract law, copyright law, and confidentiality laws. So, dear colleagues, if you remember, my presentation title asked a question, oral history as archives. I hope by now you agree with me that we can drop the question mark. I leave you with two thoughts. Firstly, by rethinking archives to include both the byproduct and the deliberate testimonies, we arrive at a point where oral history as archives serves to uphold the values and goals of preservation, accountability, and memory. Secondly, the relationship between memory and evidence lies at the heart of oral history's archival nature. Memory is not simply personal recollection. It is a form of evidence that, when properly collected and contextualized, provides irreplaceable insights into historical experience. In service of this, legal and ethical frameworks raise the accountability of oral history practice, emphasizing the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved in its collection, preservation, and use. Standards and guidelines raise reliability and improve interpretation and use. These frameworks safeguard narrators, interviewers, and users alike. And with that, I thank you, and I would like to end my presentation. And I look forward to an in-depth discussion on the legal issues that apply with oral history as archives with my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. A lot to chew on. We'll see how much we can get through today. If I can invite Nompilo and Charlie to turn on their videos, and we can start the panel section of this session. I suppose I would start by asking Charlie and Nompilo on your own experiences, if I can call it that, your own experiences in perhaps having such discussions on whether oral history should be part of an archives or not, or whether it's a standalone kind of material that should be treated differently. I wonder what kind of discussions you've had on that front at the places where you work. If I can invite perhaps Nompilo to go first.
These are my early thinkings, but hopefully I have more time in the panel to think it through better. But oral history can never, on principle, where I come from, be a standalone practice. It's interdisciplinary, and it's woven into day-to-day cultural life. From the time that you grow up as a young girl, when you are sitting somewhere in the village with your grandmother, what she's going to do is she's going to teach you a song, a totem of something, but it is not just a song. It is a telling of a historical war, or of the family totem, or of the family history, and the onus is on you to listen to it, learn it properly, and sing it so that you can pass it on to the next generation. You do this whilst you're cooking, you do it whilst you're playing, you do it whilst you're plowing the field, but it's just innate knowledge and an innate way of passing ideas to the next generation, at least in the context that I grew up in Zimbabwe. But I know this is the same with South Africa. It is almost a lifestyle. So I don't know that it can be done as separate. In fact, if you want to know a lot about social history and ongoings, you really need to pull from orality to learn it. In most departments, which both in South Africa and Zim would try to treat it perhaps as more an academic discipline, is that they reduce from it, they take away from it the cultural component and the everydayness of it because of the need to try and force theories out of it. So I think that's my insight for now, to say it is not separate to anything. It is an everyday part of life. And it's actually the way knowledge is passed down mostly. I just think that in my context, there has to be a greater attempt to archive it. It doesn't help if intergenerational knowledge is being passed, if it's actually not being captured. So the idea of recording this more is, and keeping it, is what becomes something that I would like to see happening more. But its existence is there. It's just not captured, and it's not used as intellectual material because it's associated with tradition and folklore and women. yeah, that's what I think.
Can I perhaps, before I come to you, Charlie, I'll just respond a little bit on that. I think, Nompilo, you've touched on what, I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but in my brief readings, what is referred to sometimes as oral tradition, especially in certain regions and countries. And there was, I suppose, this question mark. I think there was a question, in fact, I saw in the chat, where one of the participants have referred to the oral history that's passed on from generation to generation, right? So if I respectfully, perhaps that was a reference to oral traditions, perhaps. Would that be correct? Would that be the proper phrasing to talk about what you have just shared, Nompilo?
Oral history is a very wide term. Where I come from, it speaks to the creative arts and just the creative world as we know it. So a lot of what I've shared is definitely oral traditions, but it falls under the oral history umbrella. At least that's how I understand it.
I did read it's going back to 1986, a UNESCO report where they talked about the starting to record oral traditions and that the differences, if you will, once you record them and that sometimes there's the differences between oral history and oral tradition fade a little bit because you are recording a tale, maybe perhaps a poetry at that point in time for that particular narrator. Okay, so it's actually a very rich that in certain traditions and in certain communities, it really takes on a different meaning. I think we can see here. Charlie, if I can come to you, your own experiences on any discussions of oral history versus archives as such.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Mark and Nompilo, and everyone who's attending today. I can see there's already lots of discussion going on. I think what's so interesting about this discussion today is that we're all coming at it from different geographical perspectives, traditions, and I can talk specifically about my experience of working as an oral history archivist in the UK, where the tradition of oral history that we are based in was always, I would say, intrinsically tied to the archive. So I would say the oral history tradition that we come out of was from social historians in the 1960s. The Oral History Society was founded in 1969. And this is part of what might be called history from below, history from the bottom up. But there was always from the very beginning an idea that these oral histories would be archived and they would be kept. And on the question of oral histories as kept separate from other types of archives, I'm in a quite specific, unique position where I work in an oral history department within a larger institution. But because of the way that institution is set up, we really care for the oral history separate from other records in the institution. If someone offers us a collection of oral histories that also come with manuscripts or photographs, they get dispersed amongst different curatorial areas to be managed separately. Now, there's many conversations about whether that's the best way to do things, how much you're governed by the preservation requirements to keep this material. But it's true that it means that my focus is effectively entirely on oral history. The department I work in, there's a specific oral history department, has kind of existed since around the 1980s. And I think we can say that in the UK, that was a point at which institutions started to become more interested in oral history and give more resources to oral history. So libraries, museums, later on possibly business archives. And we can talk about the extent to which this is still the case. A lot of that's been rolled back. But I think there was definitely an expansion there around the idea that oral history could be used, as Mark says, to kind of fill the gaps in the archive, to look for perspectives that weren't elsewhere. And although at the time, it's definitely true, there was a lot of apprehension from other archivists where people were wary of oral history. Can we believe it? How do we work with it? I'd largely say that now, and I can talk a bit more about a survey I conducted recently, that archivists themselves are not, in the UK at least, not necessarily opposed to working with oral histories. They're interested, they see the value. They are just, in some cases, terrified of all the bits around it. The legal aspects that we can talk about, how to care for it, how to make it available. And so I think what has changed in the context I work in is that we've moved from a point where the blockage was accessioning and bringing in the collections in the first place, to now we're at questions around how do we catalogue this material, how do we make it available, how do we deal with data protection. And I would say that that is a notable change, even if we're still saying there's backlogs in certain places. I think that's a distinctive change since where we were in say the 1980s.
Thanks for your perspective, Charlie. I think if I can link what you said to, I think something Mark alluded to earlier in his talk, where said that even archivists select, so to speak, right? So even archivists select, and I was reading an article sometime back about even by the mid 20th century, archivists were having to select only maybe 5% of the entirety of records they were looking at to keep, right? And coming closer in time in the UK, I reading about when they changed the number of years for release of archives from perhaps 30 years to 20 years. There were formal reports coming out that many civil servants were openly discussing whether they wanted to record anything anymore, because they were fearful, if you will, of the quickness by which their records would go out. And so much is, so much business or government takes place on WhatsApp nowadays, I suspect, as well. So there are many gaps in many places. I don't know, Mark, do you have a response to what you've heard?
I could respond to you, which is, I suppose, part of the sorts of ethical guidelines, as well as kind of professional standards that we develop within oral history, go a lot to ensuring that a lot of these decisions about what happens to the oral histories actually have taken place with the people that we're talking to. So there's this out, at the very start and end of an oral history, I think it's always that relationship and trust and confidence in how their oral histories, how what they say will be managed, and how the institution, which is very likely to survive beyond the individual themselves, how the institution can manage these over time. And so what you mentioned about being concerned about maybe sensitive information, I guess within oral history, we've always tried to allay those fears, at least with embargoes, with agreements on how they may or may not, or how they would be treated with the kind of the kind of care and respect, that that the narrators would like. Yeah. So yeah. So that is one way.
Okay, I would say, I think perhaps we are moving now into perhaps the certain part of the legal aspect, if you will. I think, Mark, from what you have said, what I take from there is that we need proper informed consent. I think that's the terms you use, informed consent, and the release. That has to be very clear to the interviewee. I'd like to maybe talk about a little bit about that as to how legal documentation, good interview agreements and so on, can help shape the type of interviews you get. So that's one aspect. I'll try to remember that. The other aspect I think Charlie brought up was with regard to how it is perhaps the lack of awareness or knowledge of the legal aspects of giving access or recording oral history that may be the new issue rather than the past issues of accessioning and lack of manpower and so on. And we can talk a bit about what those legal issues might be. If we discuss first perhaps legal documentation that is used by yourselves in your institutions, and whether there are, I suppose I'm curious whether there are any new innovations in the clauses that might have helped make for better interviews. That is not, it's not just gossip, right? This is serious things. It's about history. It's about well thought through systemic interviews that draw out the important information. Can I perhaps seek the views of the panel here as to whether you have seen new innovations in legal documents that have helped in your work?
I could answer that if go first, if Nompilo's okay with that. The first thing I'll say is that, just going back to your point, Eric, about the speed and reducing from 30 years to 20 years and at the speed about which things were accessible. I think one thing to keep in mind as we have this conversation is that a lot of the people who are interviewed, the speed is what they want. They want to be recorded and they want it made available quickly, and they want people to listen to that interview. They might be older and want it to be made available during their lifetime. They might just think it's an important document that should be heard. There's an intentionality with the interviewee as much as there is with the archive and the interviewer, and they have their own reasons that they bring to the interview. And I think for me, this is always part of the kind of the democratic impulse of oral history, that someone wants to be recorded and wants it made available. And one of the challenges we've had is always, how do we bring this aspect into the legal conversations that we might be having with legal teams or lawyers? How do we bring our ethics and our methodology into what might appear initially as quite legal questions? In terms of agreement, the last big change that was made in terms of how we approached interviewee agreements was in 2018, after the introduction of the GDPR data protection legislation, which is EU legislation that was signed into law in the UK and is still applicable in the UK after leaving the European Union. And the reason that the difference there was that we'd always had a form that was signed at the end of the interview that managed access and copyright. We then introduced a form at the beginning of the interview as well, which was to do with agreement that data could be processed as part of the recording. In one sense, this is quite a legal specificity, because as soon as you're recording, you're processing personal data, not just in the interview, but in terms of other documentation. I actually think it also strengthens some of our ethical points as well, because I think what's really important is making sure the interviewee understands what they're doing before the interview takes place. Say, this is what the interview has been recorded for, this is the project, this is the archive, or if that's what it's going to be used for. Here's what you will be able to decide after the interview. You'll be able to decide whether you want to close sections. Here's what you can decide on copyright. Here's how we will handle sensitive data. And then at the end of the interview, they still have the choice to make any redactions they might want to do. We're not taking any of that away from anyone. But I think it's really important at the beginning that someone's aware of what they're doing. We ought to produce information booklets alongside that. There's various other documentation involved. I think one thing worth mentioning is we also now use what's called a sensitivity review form, where after the interview, the interviewer or the project manager will be noting potential sensitivities in the interview that might need to be closed under GDPR or libel legislation. And I'm happy to talk more about that process. So I think we have a greater awareness now of third-party mentions than we did before. We always were aware of what the interviewees said about themselves, but perhaps we're more aware of third-party mentions. But as I always say, it's a legal requirement, but oral historians were always thinking about this. There's always been this sort of level of care towards the interview. We were never like recklessly putting things out without thinking about it. So it's always been part of the thought process. And although there are more legal considerations to think about now, I try to think about them as these are legal considerations that determine how we conduct our interviews and preserve them. They don't tell us what we should do. We still do what we do based on our practice and our methodology, but how we do it and in what order has to be thought about a lot more. So I would say the introduction of GDPR was the last time we had to substantively change our agreement process. And there might be some in the future, but other than that, we're using the same forms, and a lot of it will be very similar to other people on this call.
I really am pleased that you've really covered like literally the nitty-gritties and the practicalities that any oral historian must use. You just can't be reckless about people's stories, and there's general practice that has to be enforced and maintained throughout the whole process. You asked about our institutions, and I think this can be said of any institution, just as Charlie has highlighted. For example, at the University of Cape Town, where I am, and by the way, oral history is not just considered as a methodology in the history department. Oral history can be taught in a politics department or elsewhere, is that you are actually not even allowed to engage an oral history interview without actually having had studied it as a methodology, that archiving and a whole lot of, so we don't do the one or the other. We'll do a whole wide range of history methodologies. And I think the two that they focus the most on are how to take care of archives, how to analyze them, translate them, store them, and the same is said of oral history. So it does take a little bit longer, and as a result, we find more people prefer to generally do desktop study because they don't want to be bothered with the extra 6 months of sitting in class, having your interview script sent to an ethics board of the university. When we go out to interview, we carry consent forms from the university along with a whole lot of other forms, which we have to use. But I think I'm agreeing with everything Charlie said, because it's very much a world that has to be maintained through intuitive practice. But the truth of the matter is that institutions can also enforce that such things are done properly. My own Professor Schoenfield, also an oral historian, was such a stickler to the point where when I used to record stuff on the field, he would actually even ask every once in a while to hear samples, because I think he was trying to listen to the way I was interviewing and that I wasn't imposing things. And my field is particularly tricky because it's a history of violences and trauma. So there's, of course, a need then to not only have the legal underpinnings of the university, but the ethical side of doing no harm. The minute that the interview is actually making somebody, just, mentally that they can't cope, it's too sensitive, just even the ways to deal with that yourself in that situation. So I think you can never overlearn these things. They are methodologies that constantly have to be taught, reiterated, because you can never ever know it enough, and you can never carry enough consent forms around it. What I do think is probably newer, or what we are now having to learn anew over and above the methodology and the practice of oral history and the legalities around it, is around the use of IT and technology and growing technologies when we're trying to keep people's information sometimes confidential. So, for example, if I do my interviews in a local language, isiNdebele, because most people speak in isiNdebele. It takes me forever to listen to it word for word and translate it. But it's so much faster when I just put it in an AI program or something, and then it translates it so much quicker for me. But then once it's in the World Wide Web, then actually it grows a life of its own, like an amoeba. And those are the kind of things that people are trying to question, to say in which spaces can certain knowledge be shared right now with so much AI going on around, where it doesn't actually end up exposing stuff that was initially meant to be confidential. So I think a lot more of the orality is less the practice, but more what to do with the information in a way that is legal and ethical, especially when our gadgets and stuff like that can give it a different life, if that makes sense.
Maybe I thought I'd just add in a little point about forms, which is that because we, within the Oral History Center, we also seek to encourage other people collecting oral histories from the research community to deposit these forms. So many times we do recommend certain clauses for them to include as well. And the most significant one, I would say, would be the one where we also get them to include a checkbox to seek the permission that the interviews can be archived at an institution. And this, of course, would then permit the oral history interviews to be collected, even in the event that they do not want them to be archived. So whether or not so it's actually an optional kind of a clause. So it doesn't cause any detriment to the project, but it includes that sense of that they are consenting to its long-term preservation.
Eric, can I add
Yes.
another point? Just in response to one of the chats from Angeline Takawira. I think she is right in that she's highlighting that a lot of the history is from below. Whilst researchers and everybody else can be legally and ethically informed about what they're doing, there's usually disadvantage in that intellectual property for communities isn't sustained. So I think I'm just highlighting the comment and actually agreeing with it. It's something that I also haven't fully figured about how you protect the property of a community over and above the fact that it's used as part of knowledge. But I do agree that whilst a lot of the forms and the ethics and the legalities are there, the intellectual property of the community remains unprotected, and oftentimes it is usually acknowledged as the property of the researcher or somebody else.
If I can respond on that from a legal perspective, I think, of course, many institutions that create oral history and are keen to own the copyright, right? And to maybe state in the interview agreement that the institution shall own, or the program will own, the copyright. And that really comes from, once you have the copyright, then you can give the access, because even making copies of it, so that, for redundancy, so that you have enough copies, and that if in a terrible case that a repository burns down, you have additional copies. Even making that copy can be illegal if you don't own the copyright. So I think many archives and institutions are motivated by the right reasons, that this oral history is so precious that it is worthy of keeping, and that is worthy for keeping for the long term. Therefore, let me have the copyright. But then I hear, as Nompilo has mentioned, then there could be that fear from the other perspective that, hey, does it mean that if my words have been, or my copyrighted words, the maybe even oral traditions, poetry and so on, are copyrighted and owned by an institution, does it mean that me or the community cannot use that same text or language again? So I think I cannot go into all the kind of situations, but there's always that ability to do it both ways, meaning that regardless of who owns the copyright, there's always the ability to give a license to the other party, a very big license. That license can be an irrevocable, perpetual license to use it, right, for educational purposes, or whatever, boundaries you want to set, right? And so I always say that if a narrator says, no, I don't want the institution to own it, I think as long as the institution has a signed off license to use the oral history collected, that is in a way sufficient. And likewise the other way, right? So that if I'm the collecting institution, and I think this is correct, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Singapore document, we actually quite often say the interviewee can use the oral history. We'll give you a copy and you can use it for any purpose as you see fit. So I think so there are ways about this to go about it, of giving a license that's very an expanded license, perpetual one, irrevocable one, that the other party can use forever. I don't know whether anyone here, your institutions uses the same modality to give assurance that neither side will lose as such.
Yeah, I can say a bit about copyright. in the first sense, we always try to make it clear that there's a difference between the transfer of the property, the copyright, and access. So it is possible for us to provide access without holding copyright, and it's possible for us to hold copyright, but there still be access restrictions on the material. We are clear, we are honest with the interviewees and the projects we work with, and actually, if I take a step back here, I'll say that it's worth saying that we kind of bring material into the archive in 3 different ways. Some are projects that we run ourselves, where we employ the interviewers and run the projects ourselves. Some are deposits, where someone might have a box of tapes they recorded 30 years ago, and they knock on the door and say, I've got these tapes. And increasingly, what is a large amount of our projects are partnership projects, where we partner with a project, an academic project, a community project, a local heritage project, a charity that's going to think about doing an oral history project. And ideally, we speak to them before they've started, before they've put in the bid for money. And we agree, we talk to them about the type of forms to use. We provide a lot of guidance, how to record metadata. And then they go away and record it and deposit it. So what I'm going to say kind of applies to all of these types of projects, I think. So we're honest about the fact that it's preferable for us to manage the material if we hold the copyright. And we list the reasons why. That being said, if someone doesn't want to assign copyright, we won't refuse an interview on that basis, but we will make clear, this is what can be done. These are the responsibilities of holding copyright. How can we contact you? Can you keep us in touch? And likewise, if we hold the copyright, we would always, as you said, give a license back for the person or the group to use the own material, and similar to us. Increasingly, what often happens is people or groups want to retain copyright for, say, 10, 15 years while they're working with the material. And after that, they're happy for copyright to transfer to the library. The thing about copyright is, because it will normally last past the lifetime of the individual, we often say to people, do your children or your descendants, are they going to want this copyright? I know you think it's a nice thing to pass on, and do they want to be contacted for all these requests? And maybe they do. Again, that's fine. I think where it matters most, and again, we're not categorical on this. We can work with many collections where we don't hold copyright. Where it matters most is in terms of licensing and third-party use of the material. So to give one example where holding the copyright was extremely useful, a few years ago, there was a TV show in the UK called AIDS, The Unheard Tapes. It's still on BBC iPlayer if you can access that or find a way to watch it. And it was a TV show using oral histories recorded in the UK in the early 1990s, at the late 1980s, early 1990s, at the height of the AIDS epidemic in the UK. And the TV show used actors to lip sync the oral histories in the show. We were unsure about how it worked. It worked fantastically. It was reviewed very well. It won awards. And it was entirely based, a 3-part show around these oral history collections. That wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't held the copyright. We wouldn't have been able to use the material for that TV show. So I think that's an example where holding the copyright was really helpful. I think the other thing to say is that we've really tried to, in terms of access restrictions, tried to standardize them a lot more so they're understandable, not just to us, but whoever might be doing our job in the future. I've got interviews from the 1980s where people say, oh, can the interviewer decide if someone listens to it? That the interviewer might no longer be alive, might not be contactable, might have no interest in making these decisions. There are collections that say no pornographers, no racists can access these interviews. This was all very well intended, but it's hard to manage that in a library to ask people on the way in. So those interviews are closed until the access restriction ends. So we've tried to standardize that a bit more. The final thing I'll say on that is that I think the question of community ownership of the interviews and the projects is a very interesting one and an important one, and that's where we think about licensing it back. But what is often tricky for us, I find, if I go back to some of these same interviews from the 1980s, that community might now be split, might have competing claims on the oral histories, might no longer exist, might be transitory. And so I think it's really interesting to think here how we manage this community ownership, community licensing with an understanding that communities are not always static and they are contested and they are changeable over time. And I know others have thought about a lot of this more in different places, but that's more of my extended thoughts on copyright.
I would just respond just quickly on the last bit to just say that my takeaway there would be that an institution, spending the effort to make good oral histories as such, to record good oral histories, and to then have that system in place to preserve it forever, must, it seems to me, either get the copyright or get a pretty extensive license, so that you can operate independently as such of the interviewee or the community. Of course, respecting whatever restrictions or boundaries that they need in order to sign off on that interview agreement, so to speak. Okay, I think there was a question. I think that if I can segue a little bit from there, but linked to what we just talked about, the legal documentation, there was a question, I think, in the chat about oral history that arrives at our doorstep, but with no proper documentation. I wonder whether you face those challenges and how your institutions might have faced those challenges for oral history, where the documentation is either incomplete or perhaps it doesn't even come with anything. Any thoughts on that? Or any experiences with regard to that? If there are none, I will just give a...
I do, but I don't know if either Nompilo or Mark wanted to say anything on it first.
I have a few thoughts, but please go ahead, as this is more your field than mine. I'll let you know afterwards.
Okay, briefly, yes, it's very common. It's very common both that the forms that, well, on the one side, it's true that the forms people that would have used in the past would not be the forms that would say pass ethics boards or legal requirements now. In those cases, we are very adamant that they were following best practice at the time and following the best legal advice at the time. And I think, it seems a simple thing to say, but I've argued that to lawyers many times and really tried to make our case. Other collections will arrive without any kind of documentation. I think in those cases, it's about taking a risk-based approach. It's about making the best effort possible to see if anyone can be tracked who was interviewed for it, whether you can speak to the people who are involved in the project. And if they can't, on the legal sense, these might be declared as orphan works. On the more ethical side, I think it's worth thinking about what is the risk-based approach to which you would make these available? What is the topic of the interviews? Who is being spoken about? What is the passage of time? And from that, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about each collection assessing it on those bases. But I think that the first point would always be to investigate as much as possible. Is anyone contactable who was involved in the project?
And I really like that Mark highlighted this when he shared his presentation. I think that not every single collected or oral works becomes part of the archive. And so oftentimes, even in the Zim National Archive, the UCT archive, for example, they will often get documents which are from too far back in time, where the traceability at that point is simply too difficult, despite attempts. So I actually find that archives are interestingly, it can't always be a full picture, but ethically you also can't archive or document or collate something whose existence you don't know. So we often have archives of the unknown. You will have the full dossier and the stories that come with it, but we also, as good oral history collectors, may very well be able to say, these are undocumented papers, you're welcome to look at them, but you actually can't use them as research material because you don't know the context behind them. But there's no harm in actually that being a point of learning. But many key pictures and stuff don't make it in the archives simply because the history can't be found, and making up the story then would be out of ethics. So you can't use it. Simple.
Nompilo, if I can jump in on the ethics, and for example, if I use the AI example you brought up earlier as well, so I think we know there are a lot of court cases going on at the moment with AI, and whether the AI companies, for example, can in a way copy what they find on the internet and then use that for machine learning, and then use it for generative AI and so on. And there are all those questions around that, and court cases are going on, so it's very difficult to speak on them with any definitive way. But I suppose so there might one day be a situation where the court decides that actually that copying wholesale, whether it's music, whether it's content on the internet, whether it's oral history on the internet, and then using it to train an AI machine is fair use, for example, right? So let's say we have such a decision by the highest courts of every land, so to speak. There's then that question of, even though it is something that then the institution then can do, would you do it? Would it be within the ethics, within the understanding that you had with the interviewee? So I'm interested in hearing from the panel about the interplay on this intersection between legality, what may be legal to do, so to speak, and whether you would, and as an institution or as the interviewer or the one controlling the set of the collection, would you actually exercise that right to do something, or would you be controlled more by certain ethics that in the oral history practice? So Mark, can I draw you in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted, well, I had a response to the previous point, but I'll actually integrate it into this point because it ties in quite nicely. So this issue of legalities and ethics, and I wanted to say earlier actually an example where you have these old interviews that are collected, and there are no agreement forms, nothing, so they come to you, and I guess just as Charlie said, it's a lot to do with risk assessment. But one thing about the one maybe advantage that the institution has is that it can hold on to the material up to until the reasonable time where the copyright would have expired. So that would actually have cleared that legal hurdle. And then now we come to this question on what are the ethics of making this available to other people, where again we do not know the mind of the interviewee. And I do recall this discussion being brought up at oral history conferences, and I actually pondered over this a bit, and it occurred to me that there are examples in the world of like memoirs, or maybe not memoirs, but kind of like unpublished diaries or notes of maybe like famous authors, etc. And they would have written these as well, and they may not have said explicitly anything about destroy them or release them. And it is up to the estate or the people who actually are in custody of these records, who actually need to make that ethical assessment. And this is a great responsibility, of course, but in lieu of just going by a legal kind of like a framework, where if it's if copyright is expired, I can do anything I want with it. Of course, we want to make sure that we also question ourselves about what are the ethics, what are the implications of releasing this, who will benefit from this, what do we lose if we don't release it.
I can answer your question in a different way, and I hope I don't move you from what you were initially asking. But I come from a world where many things are legal, but they're not necessarily ethically accurate or the way to do things. I'm going to give an example of the Bleak and Lloyd archives, their family archives. They were legally allowed by the government of the time to be taken. And it was about Bushmen. It was about the Kam people, the San. So they were basically trying to figure out what is the mind of this person? How do they sound? What do they do? And it was a whole lot of oral history interviews with them. And of course, consent is questionable if in a legal framework you're allowed to study the indigene, right? Anyways, they collect them. And this is how they make a lot of assessments about the Kam people over time within what was in that time, even under racial rulership, legal. They collect these. When they're done, they legally IP, copyright it to the family. And that's illegal. That's legal in South Africa. It's a legal archive, and it has followed all the rules. It has copyright. But the ethics of it are that is not their knowledge. It's the last knowledge we have of the Bushmen. And I like what Charlie had said. There are so few of them left that ethically, access to that and stuff will help, because then we get to preserve what is actually dying out. But this family did it within what was the legal framework. Legally, also, they are allowed to determine who has access to it or not. And so you will find that because it's a private collection, they haven't given anybody access to it. And when they do, they can charge for it. And so I'm trying to answer your question. Whilst the family and the archive has been passed intergenerationally, is within a legal dynamic. It doesn't necessarily mean it's ethical. It's not ethical to monetize other people's stories where maybe their consent wasn't necessarily granted, but also at the same time, you actually can't hold the knowledge of a community, especially one that's actually passing out. So I don't know. I think these conversations are usually case by case basis, and I think the two work in tandem. It's very difficult to take the Bleak family or the Lloyd family to court, because you can find that legally they follow the frameworks. But if you were to think about the ethics behind it, then actually that's not the way to do research.
I'd also add that on the other side of the things, there are many things that we would legally be allowed to do with the oral histories that we wouldn't do because we wouldn't see it as ethical. So for there might be collections that we hold the copyright for that you could say you could do whatever, you could give them to whoever, make them go. That's not how we would approach things, because we think there's an ethical agreement that we've made with the interviewees that we're thinking through. And I think what is a really interesting conversation to have now is that a lot of this, the literature on oral history perhaps, and the way of thinking about it has been based on this model, which made sense when it was produced, that we could speak to the interviewees, we could go back to them, we could have these continuous conversations. I think what's interesting coming from the position of the archive is oral history is a mature discipline, it's a mature field, it's been around for a long time. There are collections where everyone involved in it is probably dead, certainly dead, if not they're uncontactable. So the decision making on these ethical questions is the decision of the archivist and the institution or whoever is responsible for it. So I think we're in a different point now where a lot of these things that we thought we could hash out by continuous agreement with the interviewee, going back to them and so forth, is not possible anymore. So now we have to kind of imagine this ethical framework transported to a point when no one who was involved in the interview is around anymore. And again, that there are certain things that would be legal to do that we would not do because we wouldn't see it as ethical.
You just heard my alarm for we are close to the time where we will give way to the Q&A and look at that. But perhaps if I just touch on one more thing that I think was raised earlier, I think, Charlie, you gave the example of using oral history in that documentary on AIDS, for example. Just very quickly touch on oral history as a form of evidence, if you will. And perhaps it also applies to what Nompilo shared. I mean, evidence of a culture, evidence of how people lived at the time. So there can be a spectrum of this from perspective of culture, society, to all the way to evidence in commissions of inquiry and so on. I was wondering whether you have had any either thoughts or experiences relating to the strength of oral history in such use.
I think perhaps Nompilo, you should answer this first.
The TRC. The TRC, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because there are several, actually relied fully on oral histories, amongst other things, to actually gather evidence of what had happened. And they did this between 1996 to 1998. So it's an amazing platform to actually fill out knowledge gaps, especially where 90% of apartheid material had been destroyed. From the time that the TRC Act had been passed and the TRC actually started was a 2-year period. And so during that time, evidence was being destroyed to avoid convictions. So we do know that oral histories can fill in those gaps and can be evidences. I just know that in the case of South Africa, there are different things that could have been done better. So for example, collecting 21,000 oral history accounts in 2 years is manic. I mean, I tried to do 30 for my PhD and it took me 4 years. So I can't imagine 21,000 because the sheer numbers of it is quite interesting around the depth and just the detail that you can go into. So in many regards, they say it's an oral history archive, but in many ways they say actually it's not a neutral archive because of the fact that it's collated. You are asking questions around truth-telling, around a certain topic, and so you almost really curate the information that you get. So even though the format is orality, even is oral history, the way it was done could be changed. And in fact, of those 21,000 testimonies, 2,000 were used in the public hearings. And then they began to be a question about what went into the archive versus what was shared in public, and did those different formats change it? But what a lot of people will complain about the most is that whilst a useful tool, it had flaws. It was rushed. And the biggest issue was the fact that a lot of those testimonies were taken across 11 different languages. They were translated and they were put into a management system, which was coded. So the management system didn't care to hear the full long story, just ask, is this violence? Is this political? Is this, so it was just clicking words. And they would go through this 8 times, one person's testimony, go through it 8 times. So that by the time they were done, it was just a short, concise version around coded words. Which also meant a lot of people's oral language and use of what they were saying was changed and sanitized. So we do know that it was used as evidence as one of the largest dossiers, but perhaps procedurally. Imagine going through somebody's story 8 times to whittle it down to half a page. And all translated to English. It can tell you about the shortfalls of how oral history, whilst useful, isn't necessarily used in the most effective manner. Or maybe that many oral histories are not suited for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
I can add a bit on public inquiries in the UK. An interesting case study that people might be interested in is there were 2 inquiries in the island of Ireland, into mother and baby homes. And one in the Republic of Ireland recorded a number of oral histories and it did not use them in the final report because the inquiry said they were contaminated evidence. They had been contaminated by discussion. They said this was not reliable evidence. The Oral History Network of Ireland wrote an extremely strong response to it. By contrast, in Northern Ireland, the inquiry included oral historians working on it to record oral histories and develop what they called a form of sort of aggregated truth, where multiple people telling the same story in certain places could be seen as a form of evidence. And they had to really argue for oral evidence there. But I think there's a lot written on it by some of the people who worked on it, Olivia D, Sean O'Connell, done some fantastic work, and they've written a lot about the difference between the two. And how they made the case for oral histories to be involved in that inquiry. They also had the case that they were given about a year to record them all, so it was extremely rushed. The case study that I've looked more into that I could talk a bit about is what's called the Infected Blood Inquiry in the United Kingdom. So this was an inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal, where in the 1970s and 80s, people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders in the UK were infected with AIDS and with HIV and hepatitis C through blood products. There was a long campaign for a public inquiry, which began in 2017. And part of the issue here is that part of the issue over time had been destruction of documents by the Department of Health. So a lot of the documents that would have shown evidence didn't exist anymore. They'd been thrown away. In the British Library, we had 2 oral history collections from the early 2000s that were interviews recorded with people with haemophilia and their family members, a number of whom have since died before the inquiry. Now, what happened there were those 2 collections were requested by the inquiry as evidence in the inquiry. We handed them over through a request. It was a legal requirement. We had to. But what that meant was that there were people who had since died, whose voice could be heard in the inquiry. There were family members who could write written evidence using the transcripts or the interviews that they had of their family members. And the inquiry, because it was not a court of law, took a quite expansive approach to evidence, that you could omit things that perhaps wouldn't be admissible in a court of law because they'd be seen as hearsay. So in this case, I think its oral histories did serve as evidence. They allowed people to speak who were no longer alive. They allowed them to be part of the hearings, but it's not guaranteed that this will be replicated in any other future inquiry. A lot of these things, there's legal considerations to govern them, but they're at the whim kind of whoever's running them and what their position is on archival records and disclosure and evidence and the standard of proof they want to set. But I think, and what's interesting about these, just to say, these oral histories were not specifically recorded for the purpose of an inquiry. They were life story interviews recorded so people could be part of, beyond the historical record. And people at the time spoke this would be useful for future people with haemophilia to listen to, perhaps medical professionals, general researchers. So you were using interviews that weren't recorded for this purpose, but they still served as a form of evidence. And for me, it was a very powerful demonstration of how these oral histories can be used. And I think it also, to bring back to something this, it wouldn't have been possible if they weren't archived, if they weren't listed, if they weren't catalogued and summarized. And we will also still have the contact details of people who are alive or family members, so we could inform them. The last thing I'll say is that on the flip side, all these people were very happy that their interviews were used as part of the inquiry. It's entirely possible that someone might not be happy. Someone might be interviewed, it goes in an archive, 20 years down the line, some sort of political or legal proceedings request that interview and use it, could be used almost as a form of questioning against them. So it's not always, but this was a positive experience, I think, but it's not always guaranteed.
Perhaps what I can just say as a last note in response to what you're saying also is that even in the TRC, whilst it wasn't an exact science, and certainly it wasn't perfect, it did create space for inclusivity, which is one of the key points that Mark had highlighted, to say in a culture in South Africa where women and children didn't traditionally testify, they were actually being invited to travel from the rural areas to come and speak to what had happened. And so it wasn't just the oral history that was going on, but it was also the idea that they were trying to think whose story is not being heard here. You know, it's not just a clear-cut victim, but like whose story. And we just saw so many more of like partners, children, siblings who wouldn't necessarily have been involved. And that inclusivity, 21,000 testimonies later, does matter.
Could
If
I
I
ask a
can,
question?
Mark, sorry, yes.
I was really curious. I don't think we've had such an inquiry here in Singapore, but I just wondered, Charlie and Nompilo, in your respective cases, what were the responses from the oral historians and the oral history community on how oral history was being utilized and harnessed in these examples?
Just quickly to say that the oral historians involved in these 2 projects both spoke as part of the inquiry. The 2 main people did it. They were pleased they'd been used. I think the broader question that I think was perhaps concerning to oral historians was the realization that these inquiries have the power to overrule any closure restrictions that we might place on the interviews. We can still request how these closure restrictions, they can only be made available to certain people in certain cases. But I think what where they present a challenge to oral history practice is that even though we say to people, you can close this section, you can close the interview, no one will listen to it, there are political and legal powers that can overrule that. And I think we need to be very clear up front to anyone that this might be the case.
I mean, I can't speak to the larger oral history community, but I do know that in South Africa, in Southern Africa, the oral historians are the profession, the academic practice is considered quite small. It's not, funny enough, people do it in their day-to-day lives through oral traditions, but yet there's very few departments dedicated to oral history. So the few people that did comment and who were quite displeased the most were historians. And they've often written to criticize the process because for them, and whilst it was a growing field in 94, and remember it's a brand new country, they've just had independence. So there's so much going on. So if those TRCs had been done now with so many more years and so much more oral history practice in our day-to-day, the context at that time was really just rushed and all new. And for the first time where the whole country could live together independently. Before then, they couldn't. So their issue wasn't the idea behind what was being done. They just felt that they didn't use the right set of expertise. So they would have just used administrators to do these interviews. They actually needed people who were quick on the typewriter and who could use computers. And so they felt like the expertise in how to fully do oral history wasn't used and wasn't sought after. And so procedurally, they felt that there were flaws. They even felt that there were flaws in unraveling a person who's been traumatized, who has watched bombings and things going off, letting a person finish a whole interview in tears and keep it moving, because that's part of the process. We had public TV hearings where families would literally fall apart and they would just continue with the process because they wanted the knowledge. But ethically, from a historical perspective, you kind of have to pause on that and do that. So they really, really complained about that. But the truth of the matter is that the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee exercise, whilst it relied so much on oral history in every way, was a political exercise. So I think I want to agree with Charlie to say the political agenda was far greater than the historical agenda. And so in that regard, it wasn't considered off the history discipline. It was considered off, matters of politics and reconciliation. And unfortunately, without looking for the help of researchers and academics, they thought time framing and squishing everything was better, whereas perhaps it needed more time and a little bit more thought.
Thank you very much for that sharing on oral history as evidence. Maybe I just close this part by sharing one legal principle, if you will, that's quite interesting in a way that whenever you go to courts, right, they'll apply an evidence act, right, and quite often in an evidence act in most countries, oral history, for example, wouldn't be accepted as evidence per se because it's hearsay or and so on. It's not direct. A person who may have it's not a witness giving evidence on a stand, so to speak. But interestingly, quite very often when a matter is of extreme importance, a law will actually be issued to say that because this matter is so important, we will allow the quasi-judiciary authority to accept any type of evidence because we need to get to the truth of the matter. I mean, I find that very interesting in the sense that whenever something is of extreme importance, whether it's tragedies like airplanes crashing and things like that, quite often for inquiries like that, they will lift the Evidence Act and they say that we cannot have the Evidence Act here because we want to get to the truth of the matter. And that perhaps is a strength of oral history and other types of evidence that can come into play. Okay, I have to move on to the Q&A section. We have about 20 minutes for this. I think I'll go to the Q&A. I'll try to summarize quickly the questions I see, and then I will ask for maybe quick responses from the panelists to some of the questions that we can look at and go through here. So I'm going to the Q&A now. I'm afraid I won't be able to cover everything. but I'll pick a few and then let's see what we can deal with. The archives need to prove integrity. Oh, there's an interesting one here about how oral history archives may include content that perhaps was not sensitive at the time the interviews were given, but society changes, views and language change. How would how would your institutions, for example, potentially deal with something like that? Does it mean the record, the oral history becomes closed, or is it still available but with guardrails and so on? Any quick sharing on this aspect?
I can say a little bit about that. Yes, this is something that we're grappling with a lot. I think a lot of it's to do with how we properly make public the context around which collections were recorded, by who, when, under what circumstances. I think people are very used to listening to audio, but not always getting in the mindset that, oh, I'm listening to an archived audio recording that was recorded in the 1960s or the 1970s. In terms of sensitivities, I would separate them into legal sensitivities under, say, GDPR, which might be the release of sensitive personal information that could cause substantial damage and distress. For them, we would be legally required to assess whether we make it available or not. On the question of language, it's definitely true that we have collections recorded 50 years ago where people speak in language that would not be acceptable now, in many ways was not acceptable at the time. And there's a balance, I think, between us making these interviews available as a historical record, people being aware of what's going to be spoken about in it, but also accepting that people gave the interview to the institution in good faith to look after. And we have a relationship with that person regardless of what they said. So we have not been closing sections. We have been thinking across the entire library around how we contextualize and refer to these interviews, how we describe them, and whether they are recatalogued, but the previous catalogue records kept as a historical record in their own right, because they're also reflective of how things were catalogued at the time. So this is an ongoing conversation. But one point that I'll make to problematize this a bit is that, if I can give an example, we have a very large collection called the Hall Carpenter collection, which was recorded in around the 1980s, one of the first big gay, lesbian, queer oral history collections in the UK. It's very well used, very popular, has some amazing interviews in it. And part of it was used in an exhibition once. And I spoke to the person involved in the exhibition, and one of the interviewees came. And in the exhibition, they had been referred to as a gay man. And this person, the interviewee, had died, but their partner, who was still alive, came to the exhibition and said he would have loved the exhibition, except he wouldn't have liked to be called a gay man. He was a proud homosexual man. That was the language he used to describe himself. And that was how he described it in the interview. And so I think what's interesting is that sometimes, by thinking about how we reflect these interviews now and using language, how does this match up against with how the person wanted to reflect themselves in the interview, and how we continue that. So yes, it's a very big and interesting question, and one that we are thinking a lot of our collections. And as I said, but what we're trying to integrate it more into wider policies across the entire British Library around all our documents, many of which have this problem far more than we do in the oral histories, as you can imagine, at the British Library.
I'm generally not a proponent of redacting or closing off access to parts of the archive, regardless of the time frame and the ongoings. But that's quite a personal view, because I do think that when people are connoisseurs of this knowledge, they need to be well aware of the context of the time and what was said at the time as opposed to now. So imagine if we removed every single word that is cancelled at this point. We just about would water down the archive. And I also am treating it as a as a canon of knowledge. I don't always know that archivists have the right to make a value basis about what is good knowledge now versus what isn't. Because if you were to put two different archivists with the same material, they would redact different parts of the. So it starts to use the subjective response to what people think is a sensitive matter, and that for me starts to lean on bias and imposition. So it's not something that I love, but I do get how sometimes legally certain information can have extreme issues in the long term, and that I think in a larger political scale or from a diplomatic point of view, then would need to totally be shut off.
I can share maybe 2 points. One would be that alongside our other, for example, museums and other places where we display historical material, there might be, of course, culturally offensive items, and so these are typically accompanied by certain kinds of warnings, certain kinds of labels, just so that we acknowledge it and also to let people know. So that would be one way of managing such items. The other thing, which is also interesting, because relates to internet access. And internet access was the promise of the oral history interviews that used to be on analog tape, and so difficult to listen to in real time, and you have to forward and rewind tapes. I mean, the promise of the internet was instant access. It's out to the world. Anybody can see it. People in the UK and South Africa and Zimbabwe can listen to an oral history interview in Singapore. Wonderful, right? Then we realized that sometimes interviewees may not have known about could not have foreseen such access. So there might be some point where, we have reviewed this, and so for example, some interviews that are open access, we may access them for certain sensitivities which are not appropriate to be on the internet. We might require on-site access only. So they are still open. It's just that the researchers do have to come down to listen to them. And this is also, with the, it's not a perfect solution, I would say, but it's also with some understanding that typically the people that come physically on site, they're more serious researchers, and they're also not copying them and manipulating the material, which would further enhance or further cause damage to this sensitive material.
Okay, thank you all. Mark, you tempted me very much to go down the rabbit hole of interview agreements or release forms that don't cover perhaps what we contemplate or want to do with oral history nowadays, but perhaps that's for another webinar if there's enough demand. Right, so I will move on with the Q&A that I see. I think there's one that relates to not so much law and so on, but oral history practice that I would like to get the sense from our panel today. When academics suggest oral history is not archives because the narrators tend to present themselves in the best light, how do you respond? How do you deal with that kind of potential challenge?
Sorry, can you perhaps repeat that? I'm not sure I got the question.
The question is about that. Well, the person putting the question forward is suggesting that the interviewee would tend to present themselves in the best light, and that maybe this puts then a question mark over oral history. What would be your response to that, and perhaps how you would deal with such a challenge, because it can be a real one?
I mean, as a starting point, there are so many archival documents where someone tries to put themselves in the best light. Minutes of meetings, letters, reports. This is obviously true across multiple archival documents. So on the one hand, our argument that is the same source criticism that we apply to oral history should absolutely be applied to all archival sources. And on the other hand, I think what has really developed since the 1980s or so onwards is this idea that how people might be representing themselves, how they might be remembering things, representing parts of the interview. This is historical evidence in its own right. Why they're talking in this way, why they might be some things being remembered and not others. That this itself is something to be studied and seen as a strength of oral history, not a weakness. But yeah, my starting point is always to ask, what document are we not applying this standard to? Because I think it's true for most things.
Yep, I think that's an excellent short answer. But any other responses from anyone else?
Well, a quick reply would be that in terms of whether or not the interview is properly contextualized might also relate to the amount of documentation surrounding this interview. So having that fuller context really helps in the interpretation. And what are the reasons for their particular self-representation? Even when was this interview conducted? Were there attendant events or things that were happening around the time that might have caused them to represent themselves in this way? I mean, these are all things which I guess the archives can help to preserve, and historians also have to do their work in order to really contextualize things as they are.
And if I may just quickly add in one line, I don't actually know that the researcher can or ever will be neutral. So they will put themselves in the best light, but so will the interviewee or whatever other documents or other curated things. Everything tries to put itself in its best light. That's just the truth of the matter. But I do think there's an increasing space for especially the interviewer to do some work on positionality. And just how much the story is central to them. And I think that does give a little bit of insight into some of the things that they would do and say. So I think a person has to write a piece on their own positionality as part of the research paper, because I think it gives so much more context. I, for example, did a thesis on Zimbabwe about a community of a people that I consider the community where I come from. So, I'll likely be accused of being biased because I speak the same language and I'm from the same place. But then there was a positionality thesis that I also had to write about that, to say why this and interrogate that. And I think it doesn't solve the problem, but it does tell people that I'm not neutral. I am, however, trying to be as objectively, I want to be good in my research, but that doesn't mean to say that my positionality in this whole story is this. And I think there's just room for that level of intuitiveness and meaningfulness from interviewers.
If I could just add one more thing. The other thing I would say is that I think this shows the importance when conducting an oral history project, for example, about a business or a place of living, to get multiple perspectives from different people who are at different places. So if you're talking about a workplace, people in different levels of the hierarchy, perhaps people who've worked there a long time, people who left because they hated it, people who have only just started, so I think, although people will be putting forward their own perspectives and maybe represent themselves but by collecting this almost 360 view of it, then you can aggregate these oral history if you want, and then look at it across multiple perspectives.
Okay, thank you. I see a question that has a very strong legal bent. I might try to attempt it first and then see if there are responses from others. There's this question about, Helen Gerono asks about success stories of countries that have successfully migrated their oral histories from one media to another, right? So, I mean, even in Singapore, 15 years ago, we were still using tapes and so on. And now it's all been digitized. How do you do that? If I just give a very quick answer, there can be challenges depending on the copyright law of your country and whether you own the copyright in the interview agreement or not. Because making a copy, even migrating it from a tape to a CD or to another digital media is copying, right? But in many countries, and hopefully in yours, there is a recognition that if you are preserving it for historical purposes, for educational purposes, you can make an argument that it is fair use, even though you are copying it, so to speak. But not all countries have this concept called fair use. Other countries have a concept which is called making copies for historical, for heritage purposes and so on. So there are two approaches in different countries. One where they will say making a copy for preservation purposes is always fair use and never a breach of copyright. There's another tradition, a legal tradition, where they would put in a provision in the Archives Act or something which will say that you can always make a copy for purposes of educational use or preservation by a national archives and so on. So these are two approaches, but the language needs to be in your Copyright Act of your country. But not every country has such strong, if you will, copyright acts. Yeah, so that's my answer to this particular question of migration. You either own the copyright through an interview agreement, or hopefully your copyright laws of your country have one of the two models that allows you to make copies. Okay, I think we have just about run out of time actually. So I would like maybe to just go around to our panel here and say that I think this possibly is the first oral history webinar for the longest time. I just put it that way. And perhaps if there are participants here who are here with us who want to know more about it, could you share maybe a place, a website they could go to learn more about the ethics and the practice surrounding oral history that you might recommend?
I will make a case for the Oral History Society in the UK. We've put up lots of guidance. Obviously, it is based around law and ethics in the UK, but I think there is applicable parts of it that could be used elsewhere. We've also tried as much as possible to share template forms that we use, for agreements, for cataloging, for sensitivity reviewing, and we're always trying to see what else we can make available there. So I would say that the Oral History Society website has a lot of information. It's also, if I could just make a quick plug, where you can find out more about the special interest group on archives in the Oral History Society, which has monthly meetings. And if anyone's interested in that, my contact details there, you can get in touch. So, and I know there are lots of other societies and institutions and organizations that have things online, but that's one place where you can find a lot of information.
Thank you, Charlie. Nompilo?
There's quite a few places, but I do want to draw attention to a very intriguing archive that's not just associated with my department, but a couple of history departments in South Africa. It's called the Emandulo 500-year archive, and I can type it for you afterwards. But it's this idea that it's following a longer history. It's literally trying to learn from rock paintings and everything else, what was there 500 years ago, where these guys cannot speak for themselves anymore, and where there isn't a second or third generation. It's like 10 generations down. So I don't really know how successful that archive will be. It's not necessarily an oral history archive. I think it uses different forms of collecting materials, including bones and samples. But I think it's an intriguing story, because I know that a lot more Southern African historians are trying to say we tend to use a short history, and they're trying to figure out how amongst the people of orality they can find evidence of a much longer history spanning 500 to 1,000 years before, where we don't have a tradition of writing and collecting everything. So it's still at its early stages, but I want to see, without over-analyzing and over-translating, what are we telling about 500 years ago through the materiality that we are finding?
Can I quickly respond to that by saying that, because there were a lot of people actually worried about AI in the chat, and we talked about it a little bit about it just now. No time, again, maybe it's subject for another whole webinar, but actually this is where AI has its strengths, right? AI is not for everything, and sometimes some institutions are unfortunately just using it for everything. which may not be necessary, right? But it has strengths when you are looking at a long history, when you have a lot of data to draw connections. And then, yes, a historian will come in and somebody else will come in, archivists will come in and look at the connections to see whether they make sense. But the AI can help you draw those immediate connections. So anyway, I just pause there to say AI has its users when used properly. Mark?
No, just to add to what you were saying, of course, there are also local LLMs that you can download and store, and so that the material stays within your own system.
Yes.
Yeah, which is important to remember. I'll just add that I also belong to the International Oral History Association, and so we do have a extensive list of associations and other organizations around the world, and so these can actually be found from our website, www.ioha.org. Of course, Nompilo is my colleague there, so we are both on the council. Yeah, but in terms of that kind of knowledge sharing and that kind of like really listening to the practices all around the world, we try to encourage that, cultivate that, and have conversations like this over there as well.
Okay. With that, it leaves me to wish we had more time as usual. Thank you so much to the esteemed panel today. It's been my pleasure to be involved in this. I also need to thank the Secretariat. The Congress, ICA Congress is around the corner, but thank you so much for taking the time to help us put this up, particularly Maria, Marianne, Clemons, Zainab. Special thanks also, I would say, goes to Mac Phillips, who has been a wonderful VP BCom, who has encouraged this, and Malcolm, of the chair of EGLM, for his steady support to get this across the line, and Lighty, who's there, who has helped us put this thing together. With that, I thank you. I think the ICA will have a we'll have a quick survey probably, and so let us know if there are more things you'd like us to talk about in future about oral history or the law. Thank you very much, everyone.